It was the kind of house people didn't talk about anymore. The old one on the edge of the woods, half sunken into the earth, with its splintered boards and gaping windows that looked more like empty eye sockets than anything resembling a home. Time had gnawed at it mercilessly, leaving it crooked and decaying, like an old man hunched under the weight of too many secrets. No one dared venture near it, not even the local teenagers who'd brave anything for a dare. They called it the Hollow House. It wasn't just haunted, they'd say. It was cursed. I didn't believe in curses, of course, at least not at the time. I'd inherited the property from an aunt I barely remembered. The lawyer had called it a troubled asset, which was a polite way of saying no one wanted it. I only went out there because it was technically mine, and I figured I could sell the land for something, anything, and be done with it. It was supposed to be a quick visit, just a few hours to assess the damage and document the state of the property. But the moment I stepped out of my car and onto that overgrown dirt path, I felt it, a wrongness in the air. The woods around the house were dense, far thicker than I'd expected. The trees loomed as though they were leaning in, their bare branches twisting like skeletal hands. There was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just silence, heavy and oppressive. The kind that presses on your chest and makes you feel unwelcome. The house itself seemed to breathe, its warped frame groaning softly in the faint breeze. But what struck me most was the smell. It wasn't just the damp, earthy scent of rotting wood or the faint metallic tang of rust. There was something else, something sweet and cloying, like decayed flowers. It made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. I had just crossed the threshold when I saw the first one. She was standing just inside the woods, barely visible through the trees. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, her dress tattered and stained with something dark. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the dim light, and her hair spilled around her shoulders like a shadow. She didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there, watching me. I froze, my hand still on the doorframe. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking slightly. "Are you lost?" She didn't answer. For a moment, I wondered if she was real at all, or just some trick of the light. But then she tilted her head ever so slightly, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was something wrong with the way she moved, too fluid, too deliberate, like she was mimicking emotion she didn't quite understand. I turned away for just a second to pull out my phone, and when I looked back, she was gone. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a neighbor's kid, or someone who'd wandered too far from home. But as I explored the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind felt like footsteps just behind me. The walls were covered in strange marks, scratches like claw marks, but too small to be an animal. And in one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found something that made my stomach turn. It was a doll, handmade and crude, with button eyes and a lopsided mouth stitched into its burlap face. Its limbs were wrapped in something that looked like vines, dried and brittle to the touch. I would have dismissed it as just another piece of junk left behind. But the smell was back, stronger now, almost unbearable. That sickly sweet stench that clung to everything, thick and suffocating. I left the doll where it was and hurried back downstairs, but that's when I heard it. Laughter. Faint and breathy, like the sound of children playing just out of sight. It was coming from outside. I stepped onto the porch, squinting into the woods. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, crooked shadows across the clearing. And then I saw them. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more, scattered among the trees. Children, their faces pale and their clothes ragged, their eyes wide and unblinking. They stood in small clusters, whispering to each other and giggling softly, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. One boy, taller than the rest, had something in his hands, a bird, limp and lifeless. He held it up as though presenting it to the others, and they all tilted their heads in unison, the same way the little girl had. I wanted to call out, to ask them where they'd come from, but my voice caught in my throat. Something about them was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too synchronized, like marionettes on invisible strings. And their eyes, God, their eyes were too bright, reflecting the fading sunlight like mirrors. Suddenly, they scattered, darting deeper into the woods with startling speed. The laughter faded with them, swallowed by the silence, and I was left standing there, trembling. I should have left then and there. I should have gotten in my car and driven as far away as I could. But something compelled me to stay, to find out what was really happening. I don't know if it was curiosity or madness, but I went back into the house and followed the sound of faint whispers to the basement. The door was heavy, the hinges shrieking as I pulled it open. The air down there was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell was overwhelming. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw it. Symbols, carved into the walls and floor, crude and jagged. Circles, spirals, and shapes I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a pit, an old, shallow well lined with stones. The whispers were louder now, rising from the pit like steam, and as I peered into the darkness, I saw them again. The children, climbing, crawling, their pale faces turned upward, their hands clawing at the sides of the well as they pulled themselves closer. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when I heard the laughter again, echoing behind me. I don't remember starting the car or driving away, but I must have, because I woke up hours later in a cheap motel miles from the house. I don't know what they were, spirits, monsters, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. They weren't children. Not anymore. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. Laughing, whispering, calling me back to the woods. It started with insomnia. The kind of sleeplessness that leaves your mind restless, wandering into corners it shouldn't explore. I'd been spending too much time online, scrolling through forums, watching conspiracy videos, and delving into the darker recesses of the web. It was there, in a flickering chat room on the edge of the deep web, that I first encountered what I can only describe as my reflection. The chat room was called The Looking Glass, a name that felt poetic at the time, but would later send chills down my spine. It was a strange space, an anonymous forum where people shared cryptic stories, blurry photos of shadowy figures, and whispered rumors about things better left unseen. I wasn't there to participate, just to observe, a voyeur in the void. But then a private message blinked onto my screen. "Hello, Alex." I froze. My name wasn't listed anywhere. Not in my username, not in the profile I'd hastily filled out. My heart thudded as I stared at the message. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly, as though they had been waiting. "You know who I am." I glanced around my dimly lit room, the glow from the monitor casting long shadows across the walls. The air felt heavier, like the oxygen had thickened. I typed again, my fingers trembling. "Stop messing around. Who are you?" The next message made my stomach drop. "Look behind you." I didn't move. I couldn't. My chair creaked as I shifted slightly, my peripheral vision catching nothing but the static darkness of my room. My pulse hammered in my ears. It was a prank, I told myself. Someone had hacked my webcam, or maybe they were guessing, trying to scare me. But then, they sent a link. "Click it. You need to see." Every instinct screamed at me to close the laptop and walk away, But curiosity is a wicked thing. I clicked the link. It led to a live video feed, a grainy black and white stream of a room, my room, the exact angle of my desk, the clutter of coffee mugs and notebooks. And there, seated in front of the screen, was me, not a reflection, not a webcam glitch. It was me. My same face, my same clothes, even the tiny scar above my eyebrow from when I fell off a bike as a kid. But the figure wasn't moving. It sat perfectly still, staring into the screen, unblinking. I leaned closer to my monitor, and as I did, the figure on the feed leaned forward too, mirroring me perfectly. It wasn't a delay. It wasn't lag. It was instant, like looking into a mirror. I raised my hand. It raised its hand. I opened my mouth. It opened its mouth. But then it stopped. It froze mid-motion, its hand still raised, its mouth slightly parted. I watched, paralyzed, as a slow, unnatural smile spread across its face. A toothy grin that didn't reach the eyes. My face, but not my expression. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst. And then it spoke. Not through the video feed, but through my speakers, its voice crackling and distorted like a broken radio signal. Yet it was unmistakably my voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The screen flickered, and the feed cut to black. My reflection, the other me, was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty screen, the silence in the room oppressive. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. Then, my phone buzzed. A notification. It was a photo. From an unknown number. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My thumb hesitated before opening it. The image was dark, blurry, but unmistakable. It was a photo of me, sitting at my desk in the exact position I was in now. My breath caught as I realized something was wrong. In the photo, there was a shadow behind me. Tall, angular, and impossibly thin, its outline jagged, like it didn't belong in this world. I whipped around, my chair spinning violently, but the room was empty. Just the hum of my computer and the distant sound of a car passing outside. I wanted to believe it was a trick, a sick joke, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had seen me. Something had found me. I don't remember shutting off my computer or crawling into bed, but I must have, because I woke up hours later, drenched in sweat and clutching my phone. The photo was gone. The chat room link had disappeared from my browser history. Even the Looking Glass forum was gone, as if it had never existed. But I still see it sometimes. In reflections, in the corner of my eye, in the shimmer of a monitor when the room is dark. A shadow that doesn't move when I do. A grin that doesn't belong to me. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear my own voice whispering from the shadows, "You shouldn't have come here." It started with whispers. The kind of murmurs you hear late at night when you're walking alone and the city feels like it's holding its breath. Someone in my building mentioned him first, a man who lived in the alleyway behind the liquor store, always sitting in the shadows. They said he never asked for money, never moved from his spot, just sat there, muttering to himself, head bowed low. "Don't go near him," the old woman on the second floor had warned me one morning in the elevator. Her pale hands clutched her grocery bag tightly, her knuckles white. People go into that alley and come out. Different, if they come out at all. I'd laughed it off, of course. The city was full of weirdos. Every corner had someone muttering to themselves. Every subway car had someone who didn't quite belong. That was just life. But something about the way she said it, her voice trembling, her eyes darting to the cracked elevator walls as if he might be listening, stuck with me. I couldn't shake it. And then, one night, I saw him. It was late, past midnight, and I was coming back from a bar downtown. The streets were nearly empty, the air damp with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The city felt strange at night, quieter, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I was cutting through the alley behind the liquor store, the same one the old woman had warned me about. It was the quickest way to my apartment, and I didn't think twice about it. The alley was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and graffiti-smeared walls. The faint orange glow from a single street lamp at the far end barely reached into the shadows. And that's when I saw him. He was sitting on the ground, his back hunched, his head tilted forward as if he was studying something in his lap. His clothes were rags, filthy and torn, and his shoes, if you could call them that, were mismatched, the soles peeling away. His hair was long, greasy, hanging in matted clumps over his face. But it wasn't any of that stopped me in my tracks. It was the way he sat so still, so completely still, like a statue carved into the filth of the alley. I don't know why I didn't just keep walking. Maybe it was because I could hear him. Quiet, guttural sounds, like whispers bubbling up from the back of his throat. Or maybe it was because, in the faint glow of the street lamp, I thought I saw something move, something that wasn't him. "Hey," I called out, my voice louder than I intended. "You okay?" He didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't look up, just kept whispering, his words low and slurred, like a language I couldn't understand. I thought about leaving, but there was a pull, a sick curiosity that rooted me in place. I took a step closer. "Do you need help?" I asked, softer this time. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the alley was silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. And then he moved. Slowly, his head lifted, his hair parting just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin sallow and stretched too tightly over his cheekbones. But it was his mouth that caught my attention. It was twisted into a grin, wide, too wide, with teeth that were yellowed and sharp, like they'd been filed down. He didn't speak, just stared at me, his grin growing wider and wider. I took a step back, my pulse thundering in my ears. I'll just go," I stammered, my voice shaking. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a sound that froze me mid-step, a wet smacking noise, like lips parting. But it hadn't come from his mouth. It had come from behind him. I turned back, against every instinct screaming at me to run. His head was still bowed slightly, his grin still plastered across his face. But his hair, his long, greasy hair was shifting, parting as though pushed by something underneath. And then I saw it, a second mouth, on the back of his head. It was gaping, wet and glistening, the lips cracked and raw, the teeth jagged and uneven. It moved, smacking and gnashing as if tasting the air. And then it spoke. "Stay." The voice was wrong. It wasn't his. It was deeper, raspier, filled with a guttural malice that made my stomach churn. The man's body didn't move, but the mouth on the back of his head twisted into a grotesque smile, its dark tongue flicking out to lick its cracked lips. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a pile of garbage. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could barely hear anything else, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Stay. Stay with us." The words slithered into my ears, wrapping around my mind like chains. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as though the alley itself had closed in around me, the walls leaning forward, the shadows stretching longer. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the scent of something foul and rotting. And then the man stood up. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette on tangled strings. The second mouth on the back of his head continued to grin, its teeth chattering softly. He took a step toward me, and I saw something shift beneath his skin, something writhing, pressing against the surface as though trying to break free. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, sprinting out of the alley and onto the empty street. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it twice. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mouth, those broken teeth, the way it spoke. And the worst part? I could still hear it. Faint in the back of my mind, like a whisper carried on the wind. Stay with us. The next morning, I went back to the alley, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I needed to know if it was real, if he was still there. But when I arrived, the alley was empty. No sign of the man, no sign of anything unusual. Just the same dumpsters, the same graffiti, the same faint smell of decay. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something scratched into the brick wall at the far end of the alley. 4 words, jagged and uneven, like they'd been carved with broken fingernails. We are always watching. I don't go near that alley anymore. I don't walk alone at night, and I don't stop when I hear whispers in the dark. But sometimes, when the city is quiet and the shadows grow long, I feel it, that pull, that sick curiosity. And I swear if I listen closely enough, I can hear it. The sound of lips smacking. There are places where the earth feels rotten, where the air itself carries a weight that presses against your chest and whispers for you to turn back. Blackwater Swamp was one of those places. It stretched for miles, a labyrinth of thick, twisted trees draped in moss that hung like funeral shrouds. The swamp was alive in its own way, with the occasional ripple in the water or the faint croak of unseen creatures. But it was the silence between those sounds that got to you. It was too heavy, too deliberate, like the swamp was holding its breath, waiting. And then there was the singing. I'd heard about it in passing back when I was just a kid. The old folks in town used to say that if you wandered too close to the swamp at night, you might hear her voice. The opera singer. No one ever gave her a name, and people rarely spoke about her directly. Some said she was a ghost, some said a demon, and others whispered that she was something worse, something ancient. But all the stories shared one thing in common. Once you heard her song, you were never the same again. I didn't believe any of it. Not then, not even as an adult. I was a journalist, for God's sake, not some wide-eyed kid who'd been scared by campfire tales. But when I got the assignment to write about Blackwater Swamp, about the so-called siren and the people who claimed they'd heard her, I couldn't resist. It was the kind of story that practically wrote itself. A little folklore, a little mystery, sprinkle in some eerie details, and you've got a feature piece that sells. I didn't realize I was about to write my own obituary. I arrived at Blackwater Swamp just before dusk. The locals had been less than helpful, their faces tightening at the mention of the opera singer. "Don't go out there," one old woman had warned me, her voice trembling. "She doesn't like visitors." Another man, grizzled and sunken-eyed, simply shook his head and muttered, "You'll hear her before you see her. And by then, it'll be too late." I laughed it off. Superstition, that's all it was. But as I parked my car on the gravel road leading to the swamp and stepped into the humid air, I felt something shift. The world felt thinner somehow. Like I'd stepped into a place that didn't entirely belong to the rest of the earth. The swamp was darker than I expected, even with the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. The water was black as oil, reflecting distorted shapes of the twisted branches above. I picked my way along a narrow path, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the insects seemed hesitant to make a sound. I was about an hour in when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint hum, so soft I thought I was imagining it. But as I stood there, straining to listen, it grew louder. A voice, high and clear, with a haunting vibrato that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't like any opera I'd ever heard. It was older, rawer, as though it came from a time before music was something you wrote down. The melody twisted and turned, beautiful and terrible all at once. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of that swamp and never look back. But the song pulled at me, tugging at something deep inside my chest. I needed to find her. I needed to see her. I followed the sound, my boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled roots clawing at the path as if trying to trip me. The water on either side of the trail rippled, though there was no wind. And the voice, her voice, grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I came to a clearing. The water here was still, a glassy black mirror that reflected the sky above. And there, standing on a small moss-covered island in the center of the swamp, was her. She was tall, impossibly so, her figure draped in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver. Her hair spilled down her back in dark waves, blending into the shadows around her. But it was her face that stopped me cold. It was pale, almost luminous in the dim light, but her features were wrong. Her eyes were too large, too dark, and they didn't blink. Her mouth, though moving as she sang, seemed to stretch too wide, the corners curling unnaturally. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Her song wrapped around me like a web, each note sinking into my mind and pulling me closer to the water's edge. I didn't even realize my feet were moving until I felt the icy water lapping at my ankles. She saw me then. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes locking onto mine. The song didn't stop, but it changed. It was no longer beautiful. It was desperate, angry, like a wail of mourning. And in that moment, I understood. She wasn't singing to me. She was singing for me, for what was about to happen. The water rippled violently around me, and I saw them. Hands, pale and bloated, reaching up from beneath the surface. They gripped my legs, my arms, pulling me down into the freezing depths. I screamed, but no sound came out. Her song drowned everything. As I sank, I saw more of them. Faces, dozens of them, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the ones who had heard her song before me, the ones who hadn't escaped. The last thing I saw before the water swallowed me was her face. She was smiling now, her teeth sharp and gleaming. And then, darkness. They found me the next morning lying on the edge of the swamp, half drowned and rambling incoherently. I don't know how I got out, or why I was spared. The doctors said I was lucky, but they're wrong. I wasn't saved. I was marked. Her song is still with me. I hear it in the dead of night, soft and distant, calling me back to the swamp. And I know one day I'll go, because once you hear her, you belong to her, forever. The Erebus Dawn was a name whispered with equal parts awe and dread in seafarer circles. It was said to be a ghost ship, cursed and damned, appearing out of nowhere in the most treacherous parts of the ocean. Some said it was a harbinger of storms. Others claimed it carried the souls of sailors who had defied the sea's will. But no one could agree on where it came from, or where it went when it vanished into the mist. I had never believed in such stories. I was a rational man, a captain with years of experience navigating everything from storms to pirates. The sea was dangerous enough without inventing tales of haunted ships and supernatural curses. But then, I met the Erebus Dawn. It was supposed to be an ordinary cargo haul. My crew and I were tasked with transporting a shipment of machinery and supplies across the Atlantic. The weather was fair when we set out, the horizon clear and calm. By the time the sun dipped below the waves, we were well into open water, with nothing but endless ocean stretching in every direction. That night, the fog rolled in. It came quickly, creeping over the water like a living thing. One moment, the stars were bright above us. The next, we were enveloped in thick, suffocating gray. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, and the sea fell eerily silent. No waves lapped against the hull, no wind stirred the sails. It was as though the world had been muted. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the mist, a dark shape cutting through the fog. I thought it was another ship, maybe a fishing vessel or a freighter that had lost its way. But as it drew closer, my stomach twisted. The silhouette was too tall, its masts impossibly high, its hull looming like the ribs of some great beast. And there was something else, something wrong about the way it moved. It didn't bob with the waves or creak like a normal ship. It glided, silent and smooth, as if it wasn't touching the water at all. The name on the hull became visible as it emerged from the fog, written in jagged, weathered letters. Erebus Dawn. The crew murmured nervously, their voices barely above whispers. A few crossed themselves. Others gripped their tools like weapons. I tried to steady my own nerves, forcing myself to believe this was just an abandoned ship, some derelict that had drifted into our path. But deep down, I knew better. No ship should look like this. The wood was blackened and warped, as though it had been scorched by fire, but there was no sign of damage. The sails hung in tatters, yet the ship moved with purpose, its course unwavering. And then, the lights came on. Lanterns flickered to life along the deck, their flames a sickly, unnatural green. Shadows danced in the glow, but there were no figures to cast them. The ship was empty, or at least it appeared to be. But I could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes watching us, studying us. "Captain," one of my men whispered, his voice trembling, "we need to turn back." He was right. Every instinct screamed at me to get away, to put as much distance between us and that cursed ship as possible. But before I could give the order, a sound rose from the Erebus Dawn. It wasn't a bell or a whistle or any sound a ship should make. It was a groan, low and guttural, like the earth itself was crying out in pain. It reverberated through the air, rattling the bones in my chest. And then, from somewhere deep within the ship, came the sound of footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, echoing across the deck of the Erebus Dawn. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of one. But its features were obscured, its face hidden beneath a hood of black fabric that seemed to writhe and shimmer like smoke. Its hands, pale and skeletal, gripped the railing as it leaned forward, staring directly at me. I couldn't breathe. Its gaze, or whatever passed for its gaze, pierced through me, filling my mind with images I couldn't comprehend. Storms that raged for centuries, oceans that boiled and churned, ships swallowed whole by waves that reached into the sky, and then something deeper, something darker. I saw screams frozen in time, faces twisted in agony, and the endless crushing weight of the abyss. The figure raised one hand, pointing at me, and then it spoke. Its voice was like the groan of the ship, layered and discordant, as though 1,000 voices were speaking at once. I couldn't understand the words, It was a language I'd never heard, ancient and alien. But the meaning was clear. Come. The fog thickened, swirling around the Erebus dawn until it was impossible to see the ship. But the groaning sound continued, growing louder and louder until I thought my ears would burst. And then suddenly, the fog began to move. It wasn't dissipating. It was advancing, rolling toward us like a living thing. The green lights of the Erebus dawn flickered within it, drawing closer. "Full speed ahead!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. "Get us out of here!" My crew scrambled to obey, the engines roaring to life as we surged forward. But the fog was faster. It swallowed the stern of our ship first, then the deck, until we were completely enveloped. I couldn't see the water, the sky, or even the men standing a few feet away. All I could see were those green lights circling us like vultures. And then, silence. When the fog finally cleared, the Erebus dawn was gone. The water was calm, the stars visible once more. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, and the crew was quiet, their faces pale and drawn. We didn't speak of what we'd seen. Not then, not ever. Even when we reached port and disembarked, no one dared to mention the Erebus dawn. It was as though the memory itself was too dangerous to share. But I can't forget. I see it every time I close my eyes. The ship, the figure, the lights. And I hear the voice, whispering in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. One word, over and over again. Come.